Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake, and I'm excited because I'm at Republic National Distributing Company talking about a really big family, and that there's a little hint there, but we're going to be going across the pond to really talk about whiskey in general. So I'm joined with Tim Pitts of William Grant & Sons. He's a senior district manager for Kentucky and Tennessee, and don't let that Tennessee stuff fool you. He's been calling on Kentucky for 15 years, so he does understand bourbon, and he also understands the delicate nature of whiskey overall. So Tim, thanks for joining the Bourbon Lens.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we met a few weeks ago at Whiskey Live down there in Nashville, and that was a great event. And I got excited because I got to try some Glenfiddich, and I got to try some Balvenie, and I was like, hey, we need to really continue to educate our listeners here on the Bourbon Lens about other things than bourbon. There's so much whiskey out there, and I was like, hey, this would be a great opportunity. So really appreciate you making the time while you're in Louisville to record this podcast. So just to get started a little bit, tell me a little bit about yourself, how you got into the whiskey industry and how you, landed here in Louisville today, basically 30 years later.
Well, out of college, actually, I went to work for Nestle Foods, so I had the food experience. And then during some reorgs, I ended up with opportunity in the wine business. So as most people do, they go to work for Gallo. Gallo brought me in the industry, and I moved into the distributor side of the business where I sold the whole portfolio. So we had all of my iconic brands such as Maker's Mark, Wild Turkey, Four Roses, a lot of good brands, obviously, all the Barton products. So I really got excited and took that spirit path through the distributor level, and obviously took over different senior leadership roles within the distributor. Spent a lot of time up here. Our distributor then, at the time, purchased a distributor in Kentucky, which we took over for a few years back in the about 2003. So I spent a lot of time up here. And then we ended up selling to R&DC, along with Commonwealth. So it kind of came full circle. So William Grant & Sons opportunity came to me in 2007 to be a district manager and kind of run for the family, these great little brands and a lot of wine brands, quite frankly, back then. So our CEO, Simon Hunt at the time, came in and said, we want a new kind of motto for our company for U.S., and that's to be the most coveted spirits company in the United States. So with that, we sold off all of our wine brands, literally in 6 months, and any brands we couldn't own. At the time, we were having our family-owned brands, but also sold marketed brands, not owned by us. So if they didn't sell to us, we got rid of those brands, and so here we are, 15 years later, we have 100% family-owned brands with brands from all over the world. Milagro Tequila from Mexico. We have Reyka Vodka from Iceland. Hendrick's Gin from our homeland of Scotland. And, of course, the flagships, Glenfiddich and Balvenie from Scotland. A few American craft whiskeys we've touched our toe in. Fistful of Bourbon was our newest launch during COVID. Great time to launch a bourbon, by the way. And we have Hudson Whiskey from New York, which in 2010, they were the craft distiller of the year. So that really kind of got us in the mood and kind of, touching into the bourbon industry. But as we all know, with the bourbon boom, there's no such thing as an affordable Napa winery or a bourbon company. So with that, we create our own. So we had some fun with that. We've been coming here for years. Kelvin Cooperage here in Louisville is our home cooperage. We're their largest customer. So we've had a lot of time over the years spent with Kelvin and in Kentucky. So it just made sense. So been doing it ever since.
Yeah. So that leans to a lot of things, right? So you are working for a company that's got a broad and expansive portfolio that allows for you to do a lot of different things, right? And you have some big weight because you have some really heavy brands behind you in your arsenal. So when you come calling on Kentucky and, the Total Wines, the Liquor Barns and all that, the world, like, how do you feel bourbon country has adopted to not just Scotch and that part of the brand, but also, the other whiskey brands that you all own and bring to market?
Well, it's interesting you said that. So back in 2008 when I came in, we also have a little rum called Sailor Jerry, and that was by far the largest item in our portfolio. But then even above Hendrick's and all the other brands was the Balvenie. And like kind of digging in, why is the Balvenie so popular up here? Well, back then the Balvenie was a lot of single barrels. We were the double wood, so we had two types of oak. And quite frankly, people of Kentucky understood what that meant, where the Balvenie may not be as big in some states across the U.S. And a lot of people may not know it, you will now, but 3% of Kentucky's spirit business, total spirit business, is Scotch whiskey. Very small amount. Flip Flip side is, I forgot the exact percentage, but bourbon from a perspective, a actual spirit category in the state of Kentucky and shipments is larger than vodka, which would be the only state in the U.S. So truly is bourbon an anomaly in Kentucky? Absolutely. Not only from shipments, consumption, everything else. So yeah, it was a tough game to get in with the Scotch. But again, we had that leg up with Balvenie, again, because it's all about the barrel.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting is when we sat here and we did a little bit of a show and tell. You kind of gave me a background lesson like I was back in school, and I got to learn more about the Glenfiddich presentation and the Balvenie presentation that you would actually bring out to your stores you're working with. And so let's talk about the Balvenie first, right? Even though that may be the more classical and upscale brand, and I say that really loosely because they're both. I feel like single malt in general is upscale because it's higher age. It does come with a little bit heavier of a price tag most of the time, and there's not as much production, so it's more limited quantities. Not like we're pumping out like millions and millions of proof gallons of bourbon. There's only so much you can do on the tiny island of Scotland, right? So the Balvenie, when customers think of that, what do you find to be the uniqueness that sells them, that Scotch for the first time? Or is it that kind of the second one that they buy after they've tried maybe a Glenfiddich or like a young Macallan first off?
Oh, we made the discussion earlier. The mistake most people make when dabbling into Scotch is they grab a Scotch buddy and they say, hey, try this. It ends up being the biggest smoky, stinky, bacon Scotch you've ever had. And they're like, I don't like Scotch. Well, we're up in the Highlands, specifically the Speyside area. 30, 40 distilleries are up there. And typically the style of our Scotches are more mild. Let's go back to elementary school. So really, when you're looking at Kentucky, obviously you can't play with the barrels. You have 100% char barrels. There's no wiggle room there. But your recipe can change, obviously, from 51% corn. But the rest of the mash bill really changes that recipe. So in Scotland, we can't change the recipe. We have to be 3 years minimum age, which most Scotches are around 10 years, but we're 100% barley. So our entire recipe change comes from what we do with the barrels. So that's, again, what resonates with the barrels. Obviously, the barrel's super important to Kentucky because now you're going to char level and those different type toasting techniques, but we're still doing the same toasting and charring at different levels, but using different barrels. Yes, a huge switch years ago where it used to be European oak because obviously financially made sense. You got Spain and different things there, a lot of barrels, handy over there. As American barrels started coming over, we paid homage, actually our Glenfiddich 19-year-old paid homage to Kentucky and all the barrels coming down the Mississippi River and would go across the pond. So that over the years has really ramped up to literally being 85% roughly European oak being used to now roughly 85% bourbon oak. So, as I always say, the Scotch get the value. Kentucky pays $900 a barrel. We pay $300 for it. So, nothing wrong with used barrels.
Yeah, I think that's really unique and interesting overall. That you don't think about what happens to that barrel on the bourbon side after it's been used for the first time, right? Like, it's gone, right? You can't use it in bourbon anymore unless you wanted to, do some experimental things with second bourbon fill casks, and then you become an American whiskey. You're not even really a bourbon. So you can change your portfolio really quickly. So in that homage to the barrel, let's talk about Kelvin, and we'll get back to the brands here in a second. So talk to me a little bit about that partnership and how you work with Kelvin to make that work. Because I found that really interesting when we were chatting beforehand was, you got to go through the whole process, and then you have your own cooperage on the back end that's doing some things with that. So can you walk us through that process and how that's unique to you all?
Yeah, so the Kelvin brothers, obviously great brothers here. There's a lot of cooperages, of course, across the state of Kentucky. We just formed a relationship years ago with the Kelvin brothers. So we come into them literally, and the old days would actually come in and give them specs on barrels and chars. They would shrink wrap them to a pallet and send them over. So obviously through the years and transportation costs and obviously through COVID, it's just not economical. So now it really puts more effort, more work on our side. They do the same thing with the barrels, but they break them all down, strap them up, bring them over, and then we put them back together again. So the art of the cooperage, it's literally a 4-year apprenticeship, but literally our youngest coopers are 19 years on the job. So we're one of the few people. It's kind of like your HC repair person. You just farm that business out. So in Scotland, the coppersmith for all of your obviously your stills, and your cooperages typically are done or outsourced somewhere. At William Grant & Sons, we feel that's such an important part of the step. We have a cooperage both at Glenfiddich and at Balvenie. Every single Balvenie cask, because of the craft nature of Balvenie, is touched and made right there on site. Glenfiddich is touched, put together, whatever, some type of work done. But literally with Balvenie, everything's done by hand. So it's been a really unique partnership. And our master distiller, Brian Kinsman, has been at Glenfiddich for years and years. He's only our 6th master distiller. David Stewart, 56 years now at Balvenie. He and Kelsey McKinney have come over quite a bit. They spend a lot of time. The guys at Kelvin, because they're not just barrel guys; they're whiskey guys. So they really know whiskey, and they throw some barrels and go, "Hey, what do you think about this? And maybe this Scotch whiskey, or maybe a higher proof whiskey, might do well in this barrel." So a lot of fun stuff goes on behind the scenes, experimentation. Again, because we're not changing our recipe, we're playing with the barrel.
Yeah. So as you think about playing with the barrel and all the things you're doing, like. We talked about this like right out the gate, that double wood made sense in Kentucky for the Balvenie. What else has led bourbon consumers, which is bourbon in the States is booming astronomically. What's going to help convert more and more people to try more things, in your opinion, to the Balvenie or to a Glenfiddich? Because again, like I mentioned, production's more limited, but there are bottles that are sitting on shelves that people could go and try. Like, what's your biggest thing outside of, hey, don't go get a something right from the heart of peat country? What would you say in your all's portfolio would lean somebody into trying that?
Even starting with the basics, we have actually Airstone. We have really 7 single malts in the family across the brands. Airstone's one we have. It's a little 10-year-old. It's $30 a bottle. It's actually called the Sea Cask, but don't let the name fool you. It's actually aged in the southern part of Scotland, overlooking the sea. So it does not have peat or smoke to it. But for $30, it gets you in the door as far as a single malt. The larger producers like ourselves, really to get into a 12-year-old single malt is where we start at price points. And they're around $45. So, you're creeping up obviously a little bit higher than, or if not even double, what you may get in bourbon country. So the main thing is looking at your regions. Typically the Highlands and Speyside area tend to be that softer, more approachable Scotch. Labels have become much more consumer friendly over the last few years. And being a global company, we have a global package. So really it's on the label. And anything we have really one peated smoky Scotch in both of our brands. We clearly tell you that. So there's no, you don't have that surprise when you open the bottle. But that's really why I recommend starting. But you flip back kind of what started that Scotch business. We actually own one of 7 grain distilleries in all of Scotland. That's down in Girvan. It's called the Grant's Distillery. So Grant's actually globally, it's a premium brand that competes with brands like Johnny Walker, Famous Grouse. So it's number 3 globally in that premium category. So a lot of people start with Scotch and start with the premium category. They are smooth, but in that premium Scotch, there's only around 10% single malt. Everything else is grains. So some brands have 30 grains like our Grants, but some blends have up to 43 different grains in it. They can produce a smoother Scotch, but also because of the lack of just 100% barley being the single malt, it can be a little edgy sometimes. Again, even with the barrels, it's younger Scotch. So the real brand that kind of crossed over was called Monkey Shoulder, a brand we launched probably 10 years ago. Monkey Shoulder was a rave of Europe, and it's called a vatted malt. It's a very odd category. It is 3 single malts, Balvenie, Glenfiddich, and Glenfiddich, the 3 we own. Very young whiskey from these 3. We finished those and used bourbon cask. So we came with a tagline, play with your whiskey. So any bourbon cocktail you like, your old-fashioned, your Manhattan, you absolutely can drink with Monkey Shoulder. It's around $30 a bottle anywhere in the United States, and really became popular for bourbon drinkers because that grain being removed, again, 100% barley. We're not a single malt because we're 3 single malts. So we can't call it a single malt. Hence the term vatted malt is what it's called. There's very few in the U.S. available, but it really struck a chord with bourbon drinkers, especially that now you're down to a price point that's approachable. You're drinking Scotch. It's not smoky peaty. You can drink it neat. You can have your favorite bourbon cocktail. So really was kind of a game changer there. And then we can, in a few minutes, get into the 2 big Kelvin game changers that we've talked about recently.
I think what's really interesting is that there's so many ways to get into Scotch, and I don't think everyone even understands the term single malt. And so there's a video that you showed me. So we probably should have started here, but single malt. Can you give us the classic definition of that?
Yes. Back to elementary school. So literally single malt whiskey is any whiskey. It must be produced, bottled, and aged for a minimum of 3 years in Scotland. It must be 100% barley. It must be above 80 proof. And that's it. So that's a legal definition. Barrels, there is no definition on barrels. So that really comes down to, that's more of a house style when you're changing out American oak, European oak. But those are the three key points which we look back to bourbon. 51% corn, new charred barrels, minimum, 4 years now, I guess, depending on what you put labeling and whatnot. There's obviously some label changes that have happened over the few years.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the DNA of these two looking at side by side. Single malt, i.e. Scottish whiskey versus American whiskey.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes everything slightly unique, right? Is that we all have these TTB here in the States, right? Like definitions that are guardrails and ways that the spirit is created. And so, that was the thing for me as I got into this experiential drinking category for me, right? Because I'm from Kentucky, bourbon drinker. But as I started to get in, like it was adopting the idea of barley as that flavoring grain and the uniqueness that it has. And what helped me as a drinker to bridge that gap was this storm, I think, that's coming, this big tidal wave called American single malt. That's going to, I think, be a really nice bridge for a lot of people to get into the actual, global single malt category a little bit more. And so as we tried, the Westlands and the Westwards and the Wonderbacks and all of them, they all start with W's, it feels like. As we started to try all of those guys, it was like when I drank pot stilled single malt, like actual, like good stuff versus like the peaty things that I had tried in the past, it allowed me to appreciate them much more because I understood barley as a flavoring grain. And then I understood like, hey, you have to do how the sherry and the wood and all of that kind of makes a more complex and depth whiskey. And I'm not one to say proof is everything, because if I like single malt Scotch, proof doesn't really matter to me. But as you get depth and age and maturation, which you get in Scotch that you don't get in American whiskey all the time, that gives it the complexity you need. So you don't need something that's going to light your mouth on fire like 140 proof Tennessee whiskey. We all know what that is. So I think that's the real thing that I think is going to be interesting is how do people continue to bridge that gap? Because it needs to be there and people need to experience barley as that flavoring grain because it is uniquely different.
So it's interesting you said that. So let's go back. I did, of course, leave one important part of the single malt out. That's one single distillery. I think that goes without saying. But we do blend casks, much like in the bourbon country. So we may have several barrels put together that make batches. Obviously, hence single barrel is that one single barrel. But in Scotland, we're doing the exact same thing. The barrels come out. We'll take 2 or 3. Maybe this barrel has more vanilla. This barrel has more sherry. This barrel has a little more, whatever nuances. So it really still comes down to the art of blending. Mm-hmm. And that's where the master distiller, they're master distillers for a reason. Yeah. Because they really have that nose and palate. Every barrel is not going to be the same. You go the same tree, the same forest, but that slight difference in toast is going to change that barrel, especially once that liquid ages for 8, 10, 12 years. So that's where the real art comes down to, is keeping a consistent house style. But it's funny you mentioned single malt. So in 2010, we bought Hudson Whiskeys from New York. Craft distiller, Ralph Lauren's in the family. He started really that whole craft movement. He's listed up there with master distillers such as Jimmy Russell and David Stewart, global people. And we had a single malt, and we couldn't give it away. Had a slight little 100% barley, slight little kind of smoky nose to it, but literally, and here now, like you said, the tidal wave is coming with single malts. The other interesting thing we ran into probably 10 years ago, we our first, I guess, real expression of a single barrel came out with Balvenie, but the proof was different, obviously. We understand that in Kentucky, right? This barrel may be 108, this may be 104, 103, but we really got a lot of feedback because of the inconsistent flavors of the Balvenie single barrel, which is funny. You would never get that from Kentucky. But as a U.S., so we ended up doing now, we took all of our single barrels, we proofed them all down to 92. That way, each barrel still had its same characteristics, but that alcohol, because really 1 or 2% alcohol can, as you know, change a flavor quite a bit. So that was one little piece of tidbit. Now, the other thing, the little secret of Scotland that we have to let out is we can use coloring in Scotland legally.
Yeah.
And the reason we do that is because, again, we're using used bourbon casks. Some bourbon casks may be 4-year-old. You may have some bourbon casks that have had bourbon for 10 or 15 years in it. So your color differences will be quite different. So we can be on a label or a bottle on the shelf of a Glenfiddich, let's call it just 12-year-old. Well, that's a bad example in a green bottle, but you take an 18-year-old, a clear bottle. It's our small batch Glenfiddich, and the color difference will be quite noticeable.
Yeah.
So as an American going, why is there different colors in this single malt? And if you're not really familiar with single malt to begin with, you're probably not going to get it.
Yep.
You're thinking, something's wrong. Did they overproof it? Did they put much water in this barrel? So that's where color comes in Scotch production. With bourbon, you don't have that issue because in a new charred barrel, the color's absolutely going to be there. So a slight tint from dark brown to lighter dark brown it's not really visible, you should say. So that was two fun little things that happened in the single malt Scotch world that we do have a little leeway in.
So getting into the whiskeys, Balvenie, there was a triple wood that you all did that was international. My buddy got his hands on one when he was traveling, and I got to taste it because he brought it back duty free, and it was phenomenal. So that kind of was like, hey, this Balvenie thing's good. And then I went to the store and I'm like, I don't see that. And then so when I met you, you kind of explained all those things to me a little bit, but what are those things that are attracting people to that higher end, Balvenie? Because we were talking like even your ultra premiums, 50-year-old age stated, are competing with, the name brands of Scotch, right? So how is Balvenie differentiating itself in this marketplace? It's pretty crowded.
It's very crowded. And really right now, obviously with allocation, supply chain, and Balvenie is one that still it's a number 4 global single malt Scotch in the world, but very handcrafted. Well, those same little 8 or 10 stills that were there 15 years ago when I started are still there. Unfortunately, you throw on 10% growth, and that kind of lets you know where we are with the availability of the Balvenie specifically. Glenfiddich, we've addressed that by adding stills, so we're kind of ramping up production, and it is the number 1 single malt by volume in the world, but yet very handcrafted still. So some things we're doing now, we've really gone back, and the U.S. consumer has really wanted more flavors. Flavor is a really big touch button now. So in the bourbon country, you're getting all these flavors from things you're doing, or American whiskeys. And I don't mean apple, I don't mean caramel flavors, but just different types of oak and whatnot. So we're really, we kind of took the Balvenie, we stepped back. We had a 12-year double wood and a 17. Well, same product 5 years later, definitely different, but too similar. So we're replacing that this year with a 16-year-old Pinot cask French oak. Brings a whole lot of new flavors to the party, so to speak. Our 21-year-old, we've always done in a port wood. It's always been there, always will be. Our 14-year, using our casks that have been seasoned with Caribbean rum. So bringing these different flavors to the party really have kind of kept that American interest peaked a lot. And the fun part is we're kind of, when we roll them out, we kind of, sometimes they go away. We try to keep, the 4 staples that are always around. Yeah. Same with Glenfiddich. We have a little more flexibility with Glenfiddich because we have more liquid, quite frankly. So we can really play with ice wine casks. We can play with an IPA cask. We took the coolest, hippest hoppy brewmaster over in Scotland and used his cask and put our whiskey in it and had that IPA cask, which is, stellar. Yeah. We let 20 whiskey geeks come over and pick 20 barrels. And that was our Glenfiddich Project 20 XX for the 20 different samples. First fill, second fill, sherry cask, you name it. And this, just a collage of flavors within this product. And that's really driven, obviously, again, U.S. consumer interest. So you're seeing that. And I think the single malt whiskey industry, while being very traditional and formal, really, it's a big group of people that are they're all friends. They all talk. They collaborate, they play with stuff, and they literally are doing a lot of different flavors to really kind of capture the American audience more so though in Scotland, quite frankly.
Well, yeah, I think that's really interesting is playing to the American consumer some, right? Because the American consumer has gotten used to single barrels, and like this has been widely accepted for a long time as finishing barrels, right? Finishing barrels is relatively hot in the States over the last 3 years, I would say. And I would, in our, this is what's trending in 2022 episode, like that was my thing. Like finishing barrels they're not just here for a short time, they're here for the long haul. Because if you look at almost every Scotch brand, it finished in sherry, finished in port, finished in whatever, it comes and it's always part of that. Ex-bourbon, saying like, hey, like 85% or 80% of those barrels are ex-fill bourbon. Like, you're getting those imparted flavors regardless. So I think that adaptation both ways is really kind of cool to see if you look at the whiskey industry as a whole, how that plays back and forth. And I think the curation of a whole brand around, hey, a bunch of people got together and blended something that's really cool. I was part of a project that got released in the state of Kentucky last year. There was 15 people for the year 15 of this product, and we got to all blend, based upon 6 blends, and we got to put it together. So I love that idea of crowdsourcing information and taking what's old and making it new, even though it's still the same quality that people should come to expect.
Yeah, you hit the key point there. We didn't really discuss it that much, but really in the Scotch business, finishing is a key. You have a core house style, much like the bourbon companies. That mash bill, depending how much wheat, how much barley, how much rye you put in, that dictates your house style. Well, what dictates our house style is obviously the barrel again. Mm-hmm. So we all have our kind of house style. But then the word finish. So all of our products, up to the 21-year-old Grand Reserve, our rum cast, we've been doing that for 50 years. Literally, it may be 4 to 6 months is a pretty good average. Because we have our own cooperage, we found using our barrels is a safer way to go. Some parts of the world don't make the quality barrels we need, but we want to finish it in those products, i.e. rum, i.e. tequila, you name it. So we actually season those barrels with whatever that product is. Could be a rum, again, could be a red wine, you name it. We pull that liquid out and then put our liquid into those casks, and that's finishing. There's rarely few things outside of our 12-year-old Glenfiddich. It stays in the same, roughly blend, 85% used American, 15%, probably a Madeira cask or some kind of, European oak, all 12 years. But anything you almost see now is finished for 4 to 6 months in some other type of barrel. Exactly. That's where we come from. And of course, obviously, it's hitting the U.S. market. You mentioned a newer trend here in the U.S., but literally, it's been a trend for years in the U.S. because it was it. Matter of fact, I told you earlier, a cool little factoid with David Stewart, our master distiller for 58 plus years or so at Balvenie. In 1982, he was the first person to bring a single malt in the Balvenie back then, the Doublewood. So it was the very first single malt to come to the U.S. that had been in anything other than one type of oak. And literally, it sat in used American cask for 11.5 years. We actually moved it into sherry cask for 6 months, and there we go. Yeah. And of course, now you mentioned triple. I mean, we have some of our whiskeys actually. We've played with our Irish whiskey, which we had purchased Tullamore D.E.W. The Scots got to have an Irish whiskey, right? So we have Tullamore D.E.W. is the number 2 Irish whiskey in the world and the U.S. But we have several casks where we do whiskeys. We do 4 different cask selections. Yeah. So really kind of a fun play on the wood.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting. And going and staying in this idea of wood, really, there's this homage really to the partnership between William Grant and Sons and Glenfiddich and the Kelvin Cooperage guys with the Glenfiddich 14. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think people should run out and try to find that bottle if you're from Kentucky, because it kind of just speaks to that Kentucky nature a little bit.
Yeah, so we've been coming here for years, obviously. The family has. Brian Kinsman comes over quite a bit. Marketing directors come over. But really, between David Stewart with Balvenie, Kelsey McKinney, our assistant master distiller over at Balvenie, and then Brian Kinsman, spent time with the Kelvin guys. And they sit around and they go, hey, they know whiskey. We talked about before, not just barrels, but they know whiskey. And they say, maybe this whiskey of yours, maybe in this barrel, let's see what that does. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we had our Glenfiddich, actually in 1998, our Fiddick 15-year-old, we started doing a blend of sherry cask, used American, and new American. So really a heavy American influence with new oak. So they came up with the idea, let's be the first single malt to be aged 100% in bourbon cask. But not only in used bourbon cask, but let's do about 30% roughly new virgin oak, charred bourbon cask from Kelvin Cooperage. So they came over, met with the guys at Kelvin, and then hence the Glenfiddich 14-year-old was born. It runs around $50 or $60 here in most stores throughout the state and around the United States total. But when you go into that bottle, the blue canister, it's not blue for some crazy reason. It is for the Bluegrass State. And the original U.S. marketing campaign was from the hills of Scotland to the hills of the Bluegrass State, because really the DNA starts, about 10, 15 miles south of the airport over here in Louisville at Kelvin Cooperage.
Yeah.
So then when Kelsey came over to the Balvenie, and she really fell in love with that Fiddick 14 and what Brian had done, really not just paying homage to the bourbon business, but really kind of telling the bourbon consumer, hey, come see us. We play well with others in Scotch. We're not all peaty. We're not all smoky. Come play with us. So she actually did the same thing in the Balvenie. So the 12-year stories was created. Same DNA, 100% used bourbon cask, around 30% new charred virgin oak from Kelvin Cooperage. So that's a little more allocated. It runs in a little higher, probably around the $85 price range, $85 range for bottle cost. A little more allocated. So when you see that, that's something real special. But truly, DNA is absolutely right here in Louisville.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing, if anyone gets anything out of this today, is that there's so many similarities between Scotch and bourbon that people don't realize it. They think, oh, they're from this other part of the world, and they're only doing one grain. There's just so many similarities, from distillation processes to finishing to making sure you have the right time in the barrel, and it's quality blending and like all of that. People just think like, hey, only good stuff comes from the States when it's liquid. Well, the Scotch and the Irish have been doing this a way longer than the Americans have ever thought about producing whiskey. And these two brands have kind of understood the test of time, especially Glenfiddich, starting in 1887, I think I saw on the
That's correct.
on the PowerPoint earlier. And so that's the one thing I feel like people should come to appreciate. While you don't get these huge temper variations and you're not getting like these giant spikes in proof, you're getting complex depth and maturity. And when I contribute this is to children, right? So I have an almost 3-year-old. Do I want a 3 or 4-year-old who's like running around and can't like think for himself? Or do I want like a mature, like 18-year-old who can think for himself, have a thoughtful conversation, like has his own license, doesn't depend on dad for whatever? Like that's the difference, right? You're getting that conversation piece in Scotch when it's like your short burst of energy of a 4-year-old. Like that's kind of what bourbon can be. Not all bourbon is that way, but like I feel like that's what people think, or they don't think that way. They think that like, oh, it's 80 proof. It doesn't have any depth, complexity. It's just slightly drink it. And I think that's what people need to understand, is that you all are doing it in a way that allows for a deeper conversation of the whiskey versus the energy of the 4-year-old at 150 proof.
It really does. And look, let's look at the countries. I was very fortunate to be over a few weeks ago, and you walk around Scotland, you see a cemetery, and there's tombstones, 1400s, 1500s. You're like, man, that's really old. And no, in Scotland, that's not. We don't understand that age. So I think the stereotype is, well, it's all big, peaty, heavy, just kind of old school kind of whiskey, because the country's really old. And that's truly not the case whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Do they still do a lot of old school practice? Absolutely. But there's a lot of modern technology. A lot of Scotch companies are push button. We don't do that at the Balvenie just because we choose to, stay old school and very handcrafted. Glenfiddich, there's a few buttons around the distillery, We still do a lot of the techniques that hopefully make it a better Scotch, using gas versus electric and little things along the line, wood versus stainless steel. Yeah. So you see some old world techniques, but again, there's a lot of bourbon distilleries that use the same thing. So I think when people come over and see it and get a grasp of what does it really look like, if you walk through a bourbon distillery here, you walk through one of our distilleries, you'll go, look pretty similar to me. You're really not going to see this massive change. So I think that's the big misconception is, but to your point, because bourbon's newer, just the way it's looked at, obviously the hot summer heat in Kentucky, the average, 75 degree, 80 degree, year round temperature, where in Scotland it's around 60. Well, that's why we can age stuff a lot longer, quite frankly. It's no secret. Barley ages a lot longer than corn does. Yep. No secret there. It's just differences.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting, and that's what I'm excited for people to listen to this today is, that they can start to understand the difference. But where can people, find out more about William Grant & Sons, or just these two brands just in general? Like, where's the best way for people to learn more about the Balvenie and Glenfiddich?
Well, we are a 135-year-old family company, 6th generation now, but we do understand modern technology. So just the William Grant & Sons website.com is available out there. much like anything else, all the brands, you can leap from there to any of the brands in our portfolio. We encourage you to stop by the website, read about them, because and really, before you go purchase, read a little bit. We put a lot of tasting notes online, a lot of conversation about the different distilleries, meet the master distillers. So you do get a good picture. There's nothing worse than rushing out and grabbing that bottle. You get home, you're like, ooh, that's not exactly what I expected. So we want you to kind of read more. We want you to, become educated on what we have. But of course, the good part about these brands, and again, across our portfolio, is we're a family company. So when William Grant puts that stamp and that on every single label, that family name's on there, it means something. When William Grant set out to be the best dram in the valley with Glenfiddich, meaning Valley of the Deer, but that's what they did. Yeah. So they spare no expense when it comes to putting the best dram out, and no cutting corners. And so we don't apologize for the price either.
Yeah.
That's just part of the conversation. We try to offer different price points. Obviously, anything from our 12-year-old to our new 50-year-old, which is going to run around $50,000 a bottle. So if you like one of those, Jake, let me know. We'll sign you up for one of those bottles.
I'll mortgage my house and I'll buy one of those, and my wife will shoot me. Got it. So there will be no more Bourbon Lens podcast after I buy a Balvenie 50. Okay, got it. Done. No, I really appreciate you making time. I know you have a busy schedule here in Kentucky while you're here, and so I really appreciate it. Looking forward to putting this podcast out, and I look forward to trying, more whiskey that you all have produced. I was looking at the back of your business card, and I'm like, hey, there's some brands that I know, and there's some brands I don't know. And so, for me, that's one of the things I'm always trying to explore, and this gives me more room to explore in my whiskey collection. So we really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. If you would be so obliged, go out to your favorite podcast listening app, give us a 5-star review or leave a comment. We'd really appreciate that. You can go over to Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens if you want to know more about us. And then last but not least, go over to patreon.com/Bourbon Lens for exclusive tasting and opportunities with Scott and myself and some other people from around the industry. And until next time, cheers.